Okay, we're back, and we're now going to explore the Enlightenment and its relationship to European society. And what we mainly mean by this is we want to see some of the ways by which ideas, Enlightenment ideas and values, spread from the minds and pages of writing of a handful of gifted intellectuals out into the wider European world. Because remember, an intellectual movement, to qualify as such, has to change the way the whole group of people, the whole society thinks. So, uh, you know, 200, 500, 3,000 intellectuals having their minds changed by reading books and contemplating new ideas is not exactly changing the whole society, now is it? So we need to see at least some of the ways by which the Enlightenment was diffused and spread. So one of the useful ways to do this is to see the Enlightenment as involved in a marketplace of ideas, both in the actual sense and more really kind of in a metaphorical sense, or kind of as a model, a theoretical construct. So in the more realistic sense, there literally was a growing marketplace for books and published materials, magazines, newspapers, in a way that there hadn't been before. So there is an actual capitalist market for these kinds of cultural, intellectual materials. Now, of course, that's true to this day, but really wasn't true before. In the 17th century, there wasn't really such a market. Writers and artists, playwrights, and whatever they may be, they tended to make money or make careers by being having their work picked up by the government, by kings and their leading ministers for cultural affairs, and their careers were done through government and other patronage, not by going out and selling their stuff on a market in stores, or however they're sold and what type of market. But that's something that's on the rise in the 18th century, and big time. So as it says on the screen, there's sort of growing literacy rates, an increasing number of publishers of newspapers, magazines, and books, an uncensored press, relatively so in some places, though not others. England was relatively uncensored, France not so much. And we then really see the first ever professional writers and artists. Professional in the sense that they're getting paid directly, and they're getting paid, again, by selling a product. We tend not to like to think of real arts and real creativity as being involved in a market, even when it is, because we tend to think, well, that's if it's soiled and tainted by money, then it's somehow cheapened and it's not real art, it's not real, literature. But that just isn't true. Ernest Hemingway, or before that, Charles Dickens, right? They were selling their books in a competitive market, and yet they're considered two of the greatest literary figures in modern history. So, but this is really the beginnings of it in the 18th century. You have professional writers for the first time. A good example is the guy on the far right, Samuel Johnson, an 18th century British writer. He's not really an Enlightenment figure because he was kind of an old-fashioned conservative in most ways. So he wasn't sort of down with the Enlightenment values, at least not all of them, or many of them that we looked at last time. But he does fit as sort of one of the successful professional writers of the era, and in that, big time. He published both books and writings in newspapers, and became famous doing so. Maybe he's most famous today for holding a regular coffee house discussion group that brought in a lot of literary talent, famous people that would come and sit around with him, and Boswell, who was his biographer later on. But their coffee house sort of intellectual sort of discussion group became famous. But I could pick any of the writers on our list, or many of them further down the page here, to put in this position. But since we're going to cover them anyway, I put Samuel Johnson. In some ways, he was kind of like the Ben Franklin of Great Britain at about the same time as well. But we also mean marketplace for ideas, or I do anyway, in a more theoretical sense. It's kind of a useful model, so that not just in terms of books and intellectual fare selling for a price in a competitive market, but the ideas themselves being sort of competitive with each other. Sometimes that means in an economic sense too, but just in sort of how influential they are. So let's just forget about the price part of this and the cost part of it for a second, the capitalist element, and just think of it as, okay, the which ideas, right, in books or published ideas are the ones that sort of take hold, the ones that spread the farthest, the ones that have the most influence on society. Well, the ones that are the most popular, the ones that catch on, the ones that somehow strike a nerve in society, or first with other writers and intellectuals and critics and or government officials and all of the above. So you can think of sort of understanding how ideas spread by profitably think about how they spread by thinking about them as a competitive marketplace for ideas. One scholar who's really kind of an expert on this, named Joel Mocher, in a most recent book called A Culture of Growth, says the marketplace for ideas at the time was often riven by bitter disputes, rivalries, and jealousies. A cutthroat, nasty world of selfish individuals jockeying for positions, patronage, and reputations, something that a modern academic might not regard as very alien. So we'd still recognize it today. At the same time, its participants shared a set of underlying assumptions and had to cooperate and trust one another. There is no contradiction between the coexistence of such harmonious and competitive forces as an analysis of any market demonstrates. Economists have understood ever since Adam Smith that the glory of the market system is this unique combination. So he is talking there kind of about a marketplace of ideas in both the literal and figurative sense, but mostly the former. And he's saying that the beauty of markets, whether it's a marketplace of ideas and books or competing products of another type, capitalism in this kind of market economy and society is both cooperation and competition. We tend to think of it as competition only or mostly, but it doesn't take much thinking, more than a couple of minutes, to realize that that's just not true. Any kind of trade deal, for instance, whether it's one person to one person, or one company to another, or one country to another, right? That is in a certain sense cooperation. When you go and buy something at a store and go up to the front cashier to pay for it, right? That transaction is an exchange, and it's a certain cooperation. I mean, unless you just run out the door and take the product with you, but that's illegal. That's not cooperation. That's theft. So, market exchange of any type, whether it's ideas in books or cars today, or anything in between, is cooperative as well as competitive at the same time. And it's that interplay, and that's what the author here is saying, the complex interplay of those two that makes the system so amazing, any market system. The Republic of Letters. So the slide is titled The Marketplace of Ideas and the Republic of Letters. This is a phrase that's come to be used to explain the spread of ideas, right? The marketplace of ideas. So it's related. And there's a little map, as you see there, with lights, lines, lighted. And this is sort of approximating the ideas that spread from where to where. You see that it really concentrates with the brightest and largest amounts of light in northern France, where Paris is, and southern England, where London is, but some other places in between and further south and east as well. But the Republic of Letters has come to mean a really another example of, I guess you could say, cooperation and competition. The quote that I just read, the first part of it, talks about all of the competition, sometimes nasty competition between intellectuals and writers, including the philosophs. who sometimes had petty jealousies and envy of each other, and got into disputes and arguments, and human beings, and they could get, there were many of them were geniuses, and at least very bright people and well educated, and such people can be quite arrogant and difficult to deal with, and writers can be difficult to deal with, notoriously, and this was true in the 17th or 18th century as it is now. But the Republic of Letters was more about than the cooperative element in this, at least not on the actual markets of buying and selling books and newspapers and magazines, but in terms of the interaction between the individuals. So Samuel Johnson, say, corresponding by letters with another thinker. We'll see this, some famous examples of it among the philosophers who follow on our slides. But this kind of cooperation, in a sense, was necessary for ideas to spread, for one philosopher to learn something from another by reading their works, and then maybe talking to them in person at certain gatherings, or again writing letters back and forth to them. And this is the way that the ideas were shared in a way that sort of pushed the amount of knowledge, stock of knowledge, and Enlightenment thought forward. So this Republic of Letters was crucial. But there's another feature of it that's more crucial, and it's this was the 17th and 18th century version of what we'd now call peer review. And it was very unofficial through most of this time period, started to become more institutionalized towards the end of this century into the next century. What do we mean? Well, peer review today is the process by which a scholar in whatever field, whether it's the social sciences, hard science, whatever it is, publishes in a reputable journal in that field. And then from there, his peers, fellow professors and scholars from not just in his country, but from other countries as well, read the work in this journal that is sort of a professional, specific to that discipline. Let's say it's biology. Then other biologists maybe subscribe to that periodical because it's part of their profession. They need to keep abreast of other people's work because it helps them. But then they're expected to weigh in on what new research and new findings and new writings that come out. And they're kind of giving their opinion, their review of the scholarship. And this is what we call peer review. Your peers are your colleagues in the field, and if you put something out there into the marketplace of ideas, you have to be prepared to get criticism. It's going to be criticized, but the key is it criticized so much and so harshly that it gets denounced, and the overwhelming majority of those who look at it say, no, this doesn't hold any water whatsoever. Or if most of them say, well, I think there are a couple of flaws in this, but I don't think we can avoid it. And then some of those who read it and acquire it sort of try to duplicate experiments if it's in the hard sciences and such. So this is a more unofficial version of that. Now that's done. It's not regulated by the government. It's amazing that it happens at all in a fairly sort of self-regulating way, as organized and institutionalized as it is. Nonetheless, it works out that way, and it's kind of global now. It's really amazing. We tend to think that global cooperation doesn't work. Most people think that anyway. But here's an example of how it really can work. Now, this wasn't global in this case. Europe was sort of connected intellectually just to other countries in Europe. Nonetheless, that's a step in sort of a global direction, and it's quite remarkable. Since these countries, the politicians, the kings, the parliaments weren't involved in this, not directly. This is the scholars themselves, sometimes universities, sometimes academic societies, publications, again, magazines and newspapers that are kind of unofficially cooperating, and not even really by plan. It just sort of evolved into a system whereby it has some checks and balances in the writings and the ideas. Some get weeded out that are weak because they're seen as sort of not worthy. It's not true. It's wrong. This person has gotten it wrong. Now, it's possible, of course, that the peers evaluated incorrectly, and the majority of them think it's a good piece of scholarship or writing when it's not worthy, or vice versa. But the more peers you have looking at and evaluating the research, scholarship, writing of one individual, the more likely it is to sort of weed out the good ideas from the less successful ideas, the less workable ideas. So, marketplace for ideas. The Republic of Letters, these are sort of good places to start in trying to understand something about how these ideas were mixed and matched and spread out and around European society. We see also in this period, as part of all this, the rise of the public sphere and the rise of the intellectual, or one could say public intellectual. That's a phrase that's in common usage today. I have Voltaire down there in the bottom right as our representative public intellectual, but many of the people on our slideshow presentation here, our glorified slideshow, which we call PowerPoint, are public intellectuals. So I'm quoting here from a guy named Samuel Gregg, I should say guy, professor, and he talks about the public sphere, saying that the public sphere is where information is exchanged and subjected to critique by persons and organizations beyond one's own circle. In the 18th century, it grew to include newspapers and journals, exhibits and concerts, academies, museums, salons, debating clubs, coffee houses, and libraries. And a growing number of participants in these conversations came from the worlds of commerce and finance, ensuring a hearing for middle-class opinions about political topics once the preserve of the clergy, the gentry, and the nobility. So here's the latter part of that is saying something important that we haven't really dealt with yet. This is part of something it's something I have talked about in some ways, just not in this way, but this is part of the conflict I mentioned in an earlier unit, ongoing and increasing between the old ruling class, the nobility, the gentry, the top echelons of the clergy, and the up-and-coming business capitalist classes. And the gentry sometimes are in between. Sometimes they're recently ennobled, or they're for a first generation making big money in that family, but then eventually kind of settle into the old ruling class or marry into it. We've already talked about that too. But the point being made here is that since many of these learned societies, like the Royal Society of Science in London, were attended by and had membership was from a growing number of middle-class educated bankers or businessmen who just happened to be keenly interested in science. As sort of an aside, some of them are extremely good at it, by the way, even if they were amateurs. Amateur just means you don't get paid for it, you don't make a living at it. It doesn't say anything about how good you are at it. So some of these people were truly gifted scientists and thinkers that contributed a great deal to the stock of ideas and knowledge about this or that subject, but they just weren't getting paid for it because that wasn't their job. But more and more we see in these learned, educated circles where ideas are spreading, that they're spreading to the middle class because the middle class can now afford to attend. They're now being more gradually accepted into the elite world, and they're quite fascinated by some of these subjects and topics. But we see all kinds of ways in that quote: academies, museums, concerts, exhibits, coffee houses, etc. These are places, public spaces, where Enlightenment ideas were shared, talked about, spread, and help us then see that kind of outward flow of ideas from the minds of the handful of intellectuals out into the wider world in a tangible way. So the public sphere and a public intellectual has something to do with intellectuals and writers, and this, of course, is true of all of the Enlightenment thinkers and the Enlightenment project, writers who wanted to change the world by using reason, knowledge, social criticism, public commentary to alter public opinion and policies. So they think about these things, they write about what they've found or what they think is true, or provide evidence for it, and present their findings in journals or books that get published and read. I mean, if they're popular enough, and the hope is that it leads to social reform, which means it gets to the politicians and the elected officials and bureaucratic officials and kings and parliaments, and is put into law, put into public policy. That's the Enlightenment project. These guys weren't just writing to be writing. They were writing because they believed that the causes and the issues they wrote about were sort of for the public good. So, public intellectual is someone then who does scholarship or writes not just to be thought of as a brilliant artist or writer, but because they feel that they're contributing to sort of the public good. By intellectual, or public intellectual, then we mean more than scholars. The term embraces those who study ideas, but who also want to see their ideas applied to the social order. Just a more concise way of saying what I just did. Going back to Joel Mokyr in A Culture of Growth, he talked about the institutionalization of the public, say, the sphere of ideas, right? So institutionalization implied a modified and perhaps more efficient functioning of the Republic of Letters. In the 18th century, the movement toward formalized and sponsored organization grew, not only in Britain, but also through all of Europe. The academies struggled with funding, sponsorship, and at times were resisted by the universities, who viewed the academies as rivals. Yet formal and official academies and centers of learning conveyed many advantages to the scientific community, not least of which was the social prestige and the political patronage associated with being an academy member. So this is a fancy way, really, of saying, among other things, that this idea of exchange of ideas through the Republic of Letters, at first informal, became more institutionalized, with organizations like the Royal Society of London, founded, as you see in the upper right, in 1666, and kind of much more advanced and influential by the century we're talking about now, into the 18th century. One of the most famous ways in which Enlightenment ideas got spread, at least from thinker to thinker, or from thinker to elites in European society, are the famous salons. Most of these were the famous ones took place in Paris or close to Paris, and certainly in France. But there were a few such things in other countries as well. They had a big impact on the Enlightenment. It's where the philosophes showed up, and as one recent scholar has said, shocked and scintillated, meaning that they showed up to these gatherings as invited guests to share their ability to express their views on subjects that they'd written about before or were writing about, and were like the life of the party. So these actually were parties. You can kind of see from the pictures there, but as sort of the main feature of the party, talented intellectuals, Enlightenment figures, showed up to talk about their ideas. But yeah, there's plenty of food and wine flowing, and I'm sure other shenanigans going on at many of these too. But nonetheless, sort of the main thing you see on the right, in this picture anyway, they've got some of the Enlightenment figures that we'll talk about sort of identified there in the picture. But the importance of this is that this didn't make the ideas spread downward into the society of common average people who aren't intellectuals and don't have access to this kind of circle of brilliant writers and scholars and or noblemen. This is sort of an explanation of how they sort of got in touch with each other and shared ideas with each other that helped sort of one person to understand something that they hadn't before. Sometimes they even stole ideas from each other after somebody would blurt something out there writing somewhat cavalierly, and the next thing you know, somebody's basically taken the idea and run with it themselves. There's one famous example of it, but there must have been many of them. But more often, this was cooperative and productive, on all sides. So just look at this table on the right. Just picture these guys, talking about a specific subject, and maybe only one of them, Voltaire, say, is the most knowledgeable one about it, but all of them learn from that. He's a famous and gifted writer. They are too, but now they sort of ruminate about his ideas when they go home. And think, I could sort of incorporate this into my own work on something else. So this is a very profitable and productive set of social, arrangements here. These salons or parties, most of them took place, you can kind of see from the surroundings, in homes of nobility, and organized much of the time, not all the time, by noble women. So duchesses and countesses and such, and their husbands may or may not have been involved. This actually became kind of a status competition between nobility, so that you see maybe there's two noble women, and there are a couple of famous ones as well, who had kind of the most, salons and the biggest talent there. But there's kind of a competition to get the talent. So you might see two women talking in a supermarket, pushing their carts. Not that there were supermarkets, making this an updated image, but they kind of run into each other. Oh, and they're making small talk. Oh, how are you? You weren't at you didn't make it to our salon last week. Voltaire was there, but you had your salon last month, right? And Voltaire was there, so you're. Voltaire didn't make it to yours? Oh, he must have just been busy. He must have already had something scheduled. But he was at ours last week. I'm sorry you couldn't make it. Right? They're sticking kind of the knife in, saying, "Oh, so Voltaire didn't think your party was important enough to show up to, but he did mine, huh?" Right? So there's a lot of sort of petty social status competition that actually ended up being productive, because it sort of pushed a competition to get more and more talent to show up to the salons. So it's sort of an interesting dynamic. The most probably productive intellectually of all the salons was that of Baron d'Holbach, an Enlightenment thinker of the first rate, on his own. So he had a home in Paris, and he was a nobleman. He had salons himself, and he was a top sort of writer and intellectual, and he sort of invited all of the other intellectuals, some of them who were his friends or regulars, but they became famous after a while. So anybody that was of intellectual bent, if they had enough connections to get invited, or be okay if they even dropped in, would go to, at one point, D'Holbach's salon. Diderot, whose name we saw written out in the last picture, was his friend, and sort of in many ways, sort of the most brilliant person who was a regular member of the group. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who we'll see was not the most likable philosophe, was a member of the group, a card-carrying member early on, regular member, but then had a falling out with everybody, because he always did. He ended up quitting the group. So at one time or another, most of the top Enlightenment talent showed up at D'Holbach's salon. And it was quite amazing, because it was a party. They had, see on the table, good food and good wine. It's a nobleman's home, so it's a rich guy's mansion. It wasn't a huge mansion, but big enough. And they sort of had a good time, but also discussed serious ideas. I'm quoting here from A Wicked Company by Philippe Blom. I quoted it on the very first slide. I told you it's an excellent recent book about the Enlightenment. It's actually specifically about D'Holbach's salon that lasted for about 20 years, but it tells you kind of the story of the Enlightenment as a whole, while telling that more specific story. But it says about D'Holbach, he brought with him new ideas and a great hunger for intellectual discovery. He craved company and new ideas, the cut and thrust and challenge of open debate. The combination of Holbach's gracious hospitality and Diderot's connections made the salon such an important meeting place. He received a steady stream of free-thinking guests. Free thinking really meant those willing to criticize and wanting to criticize religion, traditional Christianity for the most part. An evening would typically have consisted of a reading of a new piece written by one of his guests and a discussion of politics, philosophy, or history. Sharing gossip mingled with ideas. Guests from abroad would bring foreign news, which would immediately be compared with the situation in France, while scientists came with new experiments and half thought out theories or with stories gleaned from colleagues. All this in an atmosphere that was both freer and less deferential than at the other Parisian salons, the ones we kind of just looked at, which are a bit more formal and sort of showy and snooty, even though this is a nobleman himself. After all, this was not a debate supervised by a grand hostess. Instead, the host was a scientist himself. And that's the difference. And his opinions were likely to be more radical than those of his most daring guests. That is a reference to mostly to D'Holbach's well-known atheism. He wasn't just a critic of religion; he was a out-and-out atheist. But they did have lots of disagreements, and they invited people that disagree with him about religion and many other things. So the idea wasn't just to get a bunch of like-minded people together to agree with each other about how smart they all were. The idea was to truly get debate going. So disagreement was sort of part of the deal. Everybody knew it. And it was pretty competitive at times. And it got testy at times as well. When you debate people and disagree about ideas, it can lead to hard feelings, and it certainly did at times. But overall, it was still productive, and most of the time, with some exceptions, that okay, after the competitive part is over, you might go up to the guy you were debating. I'm sorry, I just got a little heated in debate there, and I shouldn't have raised my voice or whatever. And it's okay, no big deal. I did the same thing. So most of the time, it was all good. Even if it got a little bit out of control for a time. But the cut and thrust of debate, sort of people challenging others' ideas, sharing their ideas, sometimes agreeing, sometimes not. It's a great example of the way in which the Enlightenment kind of functioned at an unofficial level, and sort of these talented figures of the Enlightenment, the most influential, getting together, especially in this salon, and trading ideas and competing with each other in sort of the realm of ideas in a productive way. 18th century coffee houses. This is another good example, which is coffee houses are mentioned on one of the previous slides, in which we can see Enlightenment ideas spread, in this case, not just to other elites, but out into the general public, common, members of the town or city, society, London. If most of the salons were in and around Paris, most of the coffee houses were in and around London. Not by design, it just evolved into a thing in London much more than it did anywhere else. Though there are some in Paris and Vienna and other places as well. And this is also part of the emergence of a public or a public sphere and public intellectuals. The idea of the public actually was something new and that first came around in the 18th century. So the Enlightenment, in a sense, created the public sphere, or the whole idea of a public. What do you mean? There's always been a public. How could there not be a public? There's always masses of people in any society. Yeah, but they weren't thought of as a group before, is what we're saying. We now talk about public opinion. Before the 18th century, that would have been like, what are you talking about? What do you mean public opinion? Who's the public? I didn't think of them as sort of a whole, as sort of a monolithic block group, as we kind of do now, at least when we talk about and write about it in this way. But coffee houses sort of were a big meeting place, in the public sphere. An important one because you get a mix of a lot of different types of people showing up, rich and poor, people from different backgrounds. So this is, again, where we can see lots of spread of Enlightenment ideas out into the general public, not just between elite writers and gifted intellectuals. So meaning the average, shoemaker could show up just to, grab a coffee. Sometimes there was even beer or ale sold at these coffee houses as well. And sit down at a table, and he overhears these guys talking. Maybe he knows who they are, maybe he doesn't. At least theoretically, he'd be allowed to get involved. Now, there probably was some snobbery, in many cases. So you'd have to withstand that, take some doing and some confidence. But sure enough, there were plenty of average people that at least listened in and sometimes participated out of sheer interest alone, and most likely went home and told their wives and kids or their next door neighbor what they heard and what they learned. And so this is one of the most famous ways that we see a diffusion of Enlightenment ideas and values. What about women in the Enlightenment? Well, there were plenty of women who were gifted intellectuals in the Enlightenment, maybe none more famous than this woman, Madame du Châtelet. So I should be frank that she's famous partly because she had a relationship with the famous at the time Voltaire. So she became kind of famous partly through Voltaire, who was considered to be the star writer of the entire Enlightenment in all of Europe. So nonetheless, it's certainly true that she was a brilliant person, and Voltaire knew it. That's probably what he liked about her, and he got involved with her. There was a love relationship there for a time between the two of them. It didn't last forever, but for our purposes here, what's more interesting is their intellectual collaboration, and using her as a good example of the fact that women contributed brilliantly to the Enlightenment. And I keep saying the word brilliant, and then it's in my quotation. But Anthony Pagden, in his book on the Enlightenment, says that she was a brilliant mathematician and physicist, the translator of Newton's Principia Mathematica, to which she added her own algebraical commentary. She wrote a translation of Newton's classic book on gravity. So to translate it effectively in a way that it sold, and it did, means you have to know your Newton inside and out. It wasn't easy to read, let alone translate. So she's popularizing Newton, which means taking Newton's extremely difficult to read book and difficult to understand ideas and writing them in a fashion that they're more digestible to sort of a learned general public. So you'd have to be not only literate but pretty smart and intellectually curious to get through even this somewhat simpler version of Newton. Yes, so it wasn't just everybody that could or would read this, but it did make Newton's ideas more accessible to more people, which is yet another way that you can see ideas being spread in the Enlightenment. So in this case, it's ideas from the previous century, but we already know there's a linkage between the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, and some writers even treat them as kind of one and the same. So this is another example of how Enlightenment ideas got kind of out there into the larger European world and eventually changed the way Europeans thought. But it happened to be done by a brilliant noblewoman, gifted in math and science, a physicist and mathematician. So I put that quote in there twice. So she popularized science. There's a couple of quotes attributed to her that are relatively well known. She said, "Self-love is always the mainspring, more or less concealed, of our actions. It is the wind which swells the sails, without which, or it's the wind that swells the sails, without which the ship could not go." I put this in there not only because it's pretty well known, but it's a typical Enlightenment idea. The Enlightenment thinkers, as we know, were trying to figure out human nature. And a very common belief amongst them about human nature was that human beings are full of self-interest. And they didn't see it as a bad thing. First of all, they saw it as it's natural, it's part of us, so we might as well get used to it. But they actually saw it mainly as a good thing, though maybe had to be harnessed at times. But meaning that people do look out for themselves. And that's what she means really by self-love. She also said the love of learning is the most necessary passion. In it lies our happiness. It's a sure remedy for what ails us, an unending source of pleasure. And in my opinion, that's totally true. And it's certainly true of me. Uh, but it's also kind of a typical statement from an Enlightenment thinker, in this case, Châtelet herself, because these people were often passionate about being, persons of letters, meaning writers and thinkers. Yes, they liked the notoriety that came with it. In many cases, Voltaire and Rousseau, as we'll see, both became famous throughout Europe, idolized by many, hated by some. But they wouldn't have gone this far with all this if they didn't have a passion for ideas and for philosophy and for thinking and writing itself. Now we're going to sort of look at another way, yet another way, that Enlightenment ideas got spread, and also at the same time look at sort of how governments responded to the Enlightenment. And this brings us to enlightened despotism. What does that mean? Well, the term enlightened despotism, is in some ways an oxymoron. The two don't go very well together, but you'll see that they kind of do. Right? So we know what enlightened means, to uh, move in a better direction, to make progress, to make the world better, to bring more light out of sort of the dark shadows of the Middle Ages, as they saw it at the time. Despotism, a despot is a top-down ruler, like an absolute monarch, a Louis XIV type, and all the three famous enlightened despots of the 18th century are the best examples of this and the most oft-cited examples of it. Frederick the Great of Prussia on the left, the Prussian king. Joseph II, contemporary, the Holy Roman Emperor, which means he's a Habsburg Austrian, with only a couple of exceptions over a few hundred years. The Holy Roman Emperor, elected by 7 electors, was a Habsburg. So it was most of the times that empire was mostly in the hands of the Habsburg family, and that outside of their own Habsburg domains, which is a big chunk of Eastern Europe, even without ruling and controlling the Holy Roman Empire. Which, as Voltaire said, the Holy Roman Empire is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Which is sort of funny and shows that Voltaire had a wit to him, but is also true. There wasn't much holy, didn't have much to do with Rome, and he was an emperor nominally, but had a hard time wielding at least centralized power. Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia, German-born, married the Tsar, and eventually, through her husbands being deceased, became the sole leader of Russia, but she was German and not Russian, though she ruled Russia extremely well. So one of its most gifted monarchs or czars or czarinas in history. So the point here is that these absolute monarchs, who didn't have to, because they can kind of snap their fingers and decide what happened in their countries, are at least reputed to have been enlightened, and that they ruled in an enlightened way, meaning they took Enlightenment ideas, understood them, were interested in them, and put them into policy, implemented them. And I ask at the bottom, did they really support the ideals of the Enlightenment project? Really? What do you think? Well, the answer, I think, is yes and no. So let's go back to our lovable textbook author, Marvin Perry. He says, enlightened despotism, an apparent contradiction in terms, as I already said, was a phrase used by the philosophe Diderot as early as the 1760s. Wherever the philosophes used this term, it referred to an ideal shared by many of them, the strong monarch, king or queen, who would implement rational reforms, removing obstacles to freedom, ending book censorship, and allowing the laws of nature to work, particularly in trade and commerce. Remember, the Enlightenment thinkers are capitalists. They're in favor of free market reforms. These monarchs instituted specific reforms in education, trade, and commerce, and against the clergy. Prussia, Austria, and Russia had to move very quickly if they wanted to catch up to the degree of centralization achieved in England and France. Which takes us back to our very first unit. We looked at centralized, nation states in Europe, and picked out England and France as the two kind of, quintessential examples. Though they centralized in different ways, as we know, they did centralize more quickly and more effectively than these three governments and monarchies here. And right together, those two and these three are the five major powers of Europe, which we've also identified as far back as our first unit. So what's being said by Professor Perry here is that one of the reasons that these three, as absolute monarchs, embraced not just Enlightenment ideas but Enlightenment policies is because they thought we're going to be behind England and France, or we already are. We got to catch up with them. So whether we like the Enlightenment ideas or not, they do have something to do with successful trade and commerce and wealth production. And if we don't get more of that, we'll be too far behind England and France to compete. So it's actually a national security issue in a sense, at least in their minds, that we embrace Enlightenment reforms. So at least part of the Enlightenment project. However, I said the answer to whether they really supported the Enlightenment or not was yes and no. So what Perry just says or wrote here shows us that, okay, the answer is yes, but they imposed them or put them into practice in rather watered down form. Only bits and pieces here and there. Sometimes a lot of it was for show, so they looked enlightened, had a good reputation worldwide and with their own citizens and subjects. So some of it was nice window dressing to maybe get pressure off their backs. Nonetheless, whatever their motives, they did bring about some element of Enlightenment reform. But it certainly wasn't even close to the whole package of Enlightenment thought and Enlightenment change that we know as the Enlightenment project. All the philosophers who had contact with one of these three enlightened despots were disappointed in the end because they weren't fully committed to Enlightenment thinking. Frederick the Great was a brilliant thinker as well as military leader and king, but he put, of course, as you would expect from a king, an absolute monarch, political decisions above sort of Enlightenment reform. So if the political decisions that he makes about going to war or signing a treaty, with another country are consistent with and sort of move in the same direction as Enlightenment reform, then there's no problem. But what Voltaire found out, who visited Frederick the Great, Frederick the Great had read Voltaire and invited him to visit for an extended stay. And Voltaire thought that he was being invited to help advise Frederick on Enlightenment reforms, and found out pretty quickly that really wasn't true. And he ended up being, again, greatly disappointed that Frederick the Great was very limited, not in his understanding, he understood all of it. He was a gifted thinker, but in his desire to implement Enlightenment changes, putting them into law, he did so in only limited fashion. Voltaire was greatly disappointed, and they parted company not on good terms. So Frederick the Great himself, as Enlightenment despot, King of Prussia, why was Voltaire so disappointed? Well, I really already told you, but I think a lot of it was probably personal and ego-driven. Voltaire thought that he was, again, being invited, for reasons of, the king wants my opinion because he knows he knows how brilliant I am because he's read my books, and Frederick the Great was impressed with Voltaire's writings. That's why he invited him. But he wasn't necessarily intending to listen to what Voltaire had to say about reforms, and didn't implement, many or any at the behest of Voltaire, at least directly. Frederick the Great is a remarkable figure in European history. On the right, you see a painting, which is a musical concert. and the person in the center is playing the flute, and that person depicted in the picture, it's a famous painting, is Frederick the Great himself. He played the flute expertly. He could have been a professional, at least if there were professionals in those days. There weren't, but he was a top flight, top rate flautist, I think, as they call them. So he was a gifted intellectual. He was a gifted musician, as well as being one of the considered being. He's considered to be one of the great military minds, military geniuses in European history as well, kind of right up there with Napoleon. So this guy had many talents, both for peaceful cultural things and war. That's kind of a diverse portfolio of talent. So the the text that's mentioned at the bottom, which is a biography of Frederick the Great of recent origin, says that he began his reign with a public commitment to the Enlightenment. He had a very clear image of himself as a beacon of reason, shining all the more brightly for being projected into a darkly irrational world. So he understood how bright he was and was apparently pretty cocky about it, and thought of himself as the voice of reason in Prussia. In a letter to the well-known German philosopher Christian Wolff, he wrote, quote, "Philosophers should be the teachers of the world and the teachers of princes," meaning kings. "They must think logically, and we must act logically. They must discover, and we must translate their discoveries into practice." Well, Voltaire didn't have access to that specific letter, but that does show that Voltaire wasn't entirely misguided in thinking that even Frederick thought that, the gifted Enlightenment intellectuals, and nobody denied that Voltaire was that, were going to sort of whisper in the ear of princes and kings, and the kings were going to act accordingly. That's what his letter to Wolfe says. Again, it's not a letter to Voltaire, but it does show that Voltaire wasn't exactly off his rocker to think that that was possible, even though it didn't happen that way in the end. Blanning, the author here, goes on to say, Frederick could not have been the first nominally Christian European sovereign not to have believed in Christian doctrine, but he was surely the first to parade his skepticism so brazenly. So one of the things clearly that attracted this bright mind, of a king, formerly a prince, son of a king, to the Enlightenment was its criticism of Christianity and religion as a whole. Frederick the Great was a notorious atheist and never changed his views on that, and really was the only one, at least among monarchs and leaders, at least those that are running countries. The Duc de Nivernais, after visiting Prussia, that's a very French-sounding nobleman. Prussia is the only country in Europe where toleration is absolute, meaning religious toleration, universal and unlimited. One is permitted to profess whatever religion one likes, and one is permitted to profess none if they want to. One is even permitted to profess irreligion. Prussia is the only country, which means atheism. Prussia is the only country in the known world where several religions coexist without it being a problem. So you can certainly say that Frederick the Great was enlightened, even to the point of policy making, or what happened in society on this one. This is the idea of religious freedom taken to kind of its extreme, which you don't see anywhere else. Now, again, if he wasn't an atheist, he certainly wouldn't have done that. But because the king had the power, and because he had his own, certain views about religion, then Prussia became a place, at least during his reign. It did change after he died. That was sort of open to all religious beliefs or no religious beliefs. And you see in other public policy some measures of enlightenment thought put into such policy. Capital punishment was used sparingly in Frederick's Prussia. Prussia, by the way, being one of the many German states at the time, one of the biggest and most powerful. Basically, it kind of turns into larger Germany in the next century. We'll get to that. In contemporary England, executions in London alone, executions for crimes, death penalty, were about 4 times higher annually than in Prussia. Also, whereas 2/3 of capital, meaning death penalty convictions in England were for simple crimes against property, such as theft of a sheep. In Prussia, only serious crimes were punished with death. So what is being said here, in so many words, is that Prussia, an absolute monarchy with a pretty stern and tough king at the top in Frederick, used the death penalty far less than England, which was moving already much further in the direction of democracy and representative government and basic rights and freedoms. So in that sense, Prussia was more enlightened than England. Frederick wrote early in his reign, if newspapers are to be interesting, they must not be interfered with. And there's another part of his realm, his kingdom in Prussia, that shows signs of actual enlightened policy, not just ideas. Although it's certainly true that he didn't live up to that as much as his statement would indicate. Maybe he wanted to, or at first wanted to, but he did end up censoring the press if it criticized the government too much, him too much. But there was some freedom of the press. Again, more so than in some other countries. Joseph II, the Austrian, and Habsburg king, and Holy Roman Emperor, lots of titles, lots of lands controlled by this guy. Another enlightened despot of the 18th century, and reading from Isser Woloch's book on 18th century Europe, which I've quoted in an earlier lecture. He says Joseph brought to the throne a reforming zeal in which few traditions went unquestioned. He was both more enlightened than his predecessor and more authoritarian, which means he made more sort of decisions by snapping his fingers and saying, get the hell out of my way. I'm doing this. I don't care what anybody else thinks. So he could be a rough leader, sort of bowling over anyone that got in his way. Above all, he was decisive. His short reign, he wasn't there for too long, saw a profusion of reforms that gave the cutting edge of modernization a far sharper blade than mere reforms in administration, taxation, or military life. An edict of toleration, a virtual nationalizing of the parochial energy, the energy of the church, an assault on monasticism, monasteries, monks, a substantial loosening of the censorship, reforms in court procedure, sort of the court system functioned, and criminal law, education reforms which called for compulsory primary schooling. They didn't get there entirely, but it was way ahead of its time to even propose it. A serious attempt at agrarian reform, which means reform of farms and successful farming, all marked the land ownership patterns. The culmination of 18th century absolutism in its enlightened phase under Joseph. I won't read the rest of that, but most famously, he freed the serfs in Austria, or at least tried to. So he announced that serfdom was abolished in an edict, and this is a good example of him acting in an authoritarian manner. He didn't consult the nobles, who would be the ones who are going to pay the price for this, because remember that serfs were almost slaves to nobles. They got free work out of them and got rent from them if they were even close to being freed, but still lived in the land. So, but he did so without even consulting the advice or even notifying the nobility that he was going to do this. He just sort of announced it. And there was a huge backlash from the nobility that in the end caused him to back down because there was so much hostility coming from the nobility. So the fact that he was an authoritarian actually got in the way, and an authoritarian personality. He used to just, I'm going to do what I want. I don't care what anyone else thinks. I'm not going to negotiate, talk to, compromise with anybody else. It's my way or the highway. That didn't work out so well because had he been more, I think, politically adept and sort of worked on this gradually and slowly and tried to talk to nobles, get them to come around and find ways to give them, some benefits if they cooperate on freeing the serfs, he might have been able to pull it off, at least with there'd be less opposition and it might have succeeded. But I think this was almost doomed to failure because of his own authoritarian tendencies. And it's not surprising that an absolute monarch who's used to wielding all the power has an authoritarian personality. They're used to getting their way. They're used to everyone doing what they say, and he did so here. But there can be a backlash. We saw the Stuart kings already in 17th century England acted very imperiously, and it cost them, one of them especially, big time. So Joseph II tried Enlightenment reforms, some of which got through and stayed and stuck, some of which didn't last and didn't make it. Unless he, probably more than the others here, at least first implemented more Enlightenment ideas into law more successfully than Frederick, we already looked at, and Catherine the Great, who we'll look at now. The third of our enlightened despots in Europe, this time 18th century Russia. A recent publication, fairly recent book on the sort of broad history of Russia in 2 volumes says in late 1766, she, meaning Catherine, introduced important changes based on the precepts of the Enlightenment. And she called something together called the Legislative Commission, which did sort of make recommendations to change Russian law and implement certain Enlightenment changes, part of the Enlightenment program. She actually, like like Frederick the Great, Frederick the Great invited Voltaire. She invited Diderot, one of the other great French philosophers we'll meet, in sort of the same kind of relationship. She was Enlightenment oriented herself, had heard of him, read his books, wanted to sort of talk with him, pick his brain. But Diderot, along with one other philosopher too, who visited, were also disappointed because they realized, okay, they're not as enlightened, or at least interested in putting Enlightenment ideas into practice as we are, and it was disappointing to them. So she, on the whole, skipping to the bottom of the quote, the liberalism of the instruction produced, the instruction was the commission's report, produced a strong impression in a number of European countries. So the point was that if the top-notch philosophers were disappointed with their actual reforms of the law and policy, other leaders in other countries noticed, it seems pretty substantial to us. So depending on who you were and what your position in society was, what Catherine the Great did looked more or less enlightened, at least, or was more enlightened in practice. Our first prime time philosopher is this guy who we've already met, John Locke. I'm covering them in at least roughly alphabetical order. I'm sorry, chronological order. It's been a long day from date of birth. So we've already looked at in a previous lecture John Locke's famous second treatise on government, but he wrote many things that were influential and have become famous. In 1690, as you see here, an essay concerning human understanding. In 1693, some thoughts concerning education. Locke is famous for talking about the blank slate. He's also famous for being a strict empiricist. An empiricist, or empiricism, was the belief that human knowledge, can only be acquired through the senses. So that and it's related to the blank slate because it's a belief, and Locke was pushing this firmly, that the mind at birth doesn't have anything in it. So when a baby is born, there's nothing there. It's filled up with sensory perceptions, and that's what turns into our ideas and thoughts, and as time goes on. So if we didn't have eyes and ears and touch and all the senses, we wouldn't have any knowledge at all of the world, which might sound like it's just true. But the human mind, of course, we know now from neuroscience and other related subjects, and even before neuroscience, that the mind already has something there. There's genetic inheritance in there as well. There's already ability in the mind if there's not knowledge yet. There's an ability to acquire knowledge. The blank slate, and empiricism sort of implied that the brain was just kind of like a sponge that just kind of soaked up something that came from the outside, that there was no active component in the brain taking in the information, maybe through the eyes and the senses, but then having to use innate powers, sometimes learned powers to mix and manage and file away this knowledge, this type of thinking in that place in the brain. So it ends up being wrong, but it was extremely influential in the Enlightenment. So sight and hearing, in investigation and exploring of nature, understanding the world, learning, that scientific endeavor depended on observation and experiment. This is part of Locke's empiricism. Epistemology, by the way, is the study. He admired the Enlightenment thinkers admired the epistemology of Locke. So, sorry, I forgot that part. Epistemology is the study of how human beings acquire knowledge. And so empiricism is one theory about how we acquire epistemological, acquire knowledge. And Locke's was empiricism, that it's all through the senses. So there are other ways to think about, and there are other possibilities to explain human understanding and how we acquire knowledge. So, but he was a strict empiricist who didn't always sort of seem to keep that consistent with some of his writings, but unless he believed that this was the only way to really acquire knowledge. He thought that external objects furnished. He wrote this. External objects furnish the mind with the ideas of sensible qualities, which are all those different perceptions they produce in us. A quote from the essay concerning human understanding. From the same piece of writing, he that attentively considers the state of a child at his first coming into the world will have little reason to think him stored with plenty of ideas that are to be the matter of his future knowledge. It is by degrees he comes to be furnished with them. So again, sort of the idea of the blank slate at birth. He even mentions a hypothetical child there. The empiricism does seem to be somewhat inconsistent with his political theory, at least from our perspective, but it didn't seem that way to him at the time, I'm sure. Next up is Baron Montesquieu. Locke was an Englishman, Montesquieu a French nobleman. Baron isn't his first name. That's the title. It's a noble title. So this guy came from the nobility, the aristocracy, and yet was an Enlightenment thinker. Why? Well, partly because the nobility were those that had the greatest access to literacy and education, college education. So they were the ones most likely exposed to Enlightenment writings, Enlightenment books themselves. So this guy, followed suit. That doesn't mean all nobility were enamored of the Enlightenment. In fact, most of them probably were not. But there's a significant minority that were. Montesquieu's one of those. We'll meet others. His two most famous books are the Persian Letters, published in 1721, earlier in his career, and The Spirit of the Laws, near the end of his career and life. He supported constitutional government or constitutional monarchy, meaning he's arguing against any form of absolutism, whether it be an absolute monarchy, a dictatorship, whatever. He was a believer in cultural relativism, ahead of his time. Although cultural relativism can be sort of argued as a good thing or bad thing, it's still controversial now. He believed in religious tolerance, like almost all the philosophers except for Rousseau. He believed in free markets, what we today call capitalism. What he's most famous for, because he had a huge influence here. Our founding fathers read their Montesquieu for sure, because they talked about it. It's in their writings that we still have. He is the guy that sort of put forward. He didn't invent the idea, but the guy who sort of worked out the importance of, sort of stressed more than anyone else ever had, the importance of separation of powers, at least more important than any other writer or thinker, thinking about what type of government reforms would make government better. Separation of powers, checks and balances. This is Montesquieu's huge influence on our political and legal system in our Constitution. The founding fathers or framers of the Constitution, like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, right? The separation of powers is a huge part of our constitutional structure, and they got much of their sort of knowledge from reading Montesquieu. Uh, one classic book on Enlightenment thought, or sort of the preconditions for it, listed at the bottom of that quote, says there was general agreement with Montesquieu's point that trade and mercantile pursuits were more likely to bring about a more peaceful world than the pursuit of glory or honor, or particularly than striving for religious virtue, which had produced such terrible wars in 16th and 17th century Europe. So the idea that again was pretty common in the Enlightenment. We'll see it with Adam Smith, the person who writes most directly and most often about free market economies, free enterprise. But Montesquieu did here as well, but argued something slightly different, that it helps to kind of bring a peaceful world in pursuit of glory, or than a world that's sort of people are focused on glory and honor. If your value system is about glory and honor instead of making money in business, in those days, you're more likely to want to, be a military leader and go out in the battlefield and conquer, some other people and win a war, violent, bloody. So he's saying, actually, by comparison, Voltaire says this too, but by comparison, business interests are far more peaceful and far more civilized than sort of the old way of life, where it was about glory and honor, winning battles and such. Voltaire, the father of the Enlightenment. I could have put him as sort of the premier of all of this up front, but since I'm doing it in chronological order, he comes third. But he is often referred to as the father of the Enlightenment, and almost everyone agrees that he's the most gifted writer of the Enlightenment. That doesn't necessarily mean he was the smartest, the most brilliant, although he certainly was a gifted mind and thinker as well as writer. But there might have been some that had sort of more mental gifts, but in terms of just their raw brain power. But there doesn't seem to be anyone that could write quite as effectively and well as Voltaire. So he was a great writer as well as thinker. If we can boil down his thought, and it's really hard because he wrote on just about every Enlightenment subject, every issue and subject dear to the Enlightenment. I think his most consistent interest in all of this, and where he kind of contributed the most, is to religious tolerance on one side and free thought on the other, which is kind of the two sides to the same coin. He said at one point, "What is tolerance? We are full of weakness and errors," meaning human beings. "Let us mutually pardon our own flaws. This is the last law of nature. It is clear that every private individual who persecutes a man, his brother, because he is not of the same opinion, is a monster." So he's saying we have to treat other people's opinions and views in a civilized way, and if you don't, you are a monster. That's a pretty strong statement. Tolerance has never brought civil war. Intolerance has covered the earth with carnage. That's a great quote. Tolerance has never brought civil war. Intolerance has covered the earth with carnage. So he was famous in some circles, infamous for being a gigantic and effective, because he's a good writer, and a famous one, critic of the Catholic Church. He's French. Remember, the Catholic, the French France is officially a Catholic country, and so he's biting the hand that fed him, almost literally, because Voltaire had access to the best Jesuit education available in France. The Jesuits have always been known, still are, for commitment to education and excellent educations offered by Jesuit schools, and he went to one of them. and then used what they taught him against them in spending a career delighting in ripping into the Catholic Church, criticizing it for this and for that and the other. Adam Smith, a fellow philosopher from across the English Channel in Scotland, who we'll get to, talking about Voltaire, said, "Reason owes him incalculable obligations." Right, the use of reason, the ridicule and sarcasms which he plentifully poured out upon fanatics and hypocrites of all sects, meaning religious sects, have prepared men's minds for the light of truth, to the search for which every intelligent mind ought to aspire. He has done more in this matter than the books of the gravest philosophers, which everybody does not read, while the writings of Voltaire are in general made for all and read by all. So the bottom part of that is a compliment to Voltaire's writing, of course, but he's saying, a lot of the greatest philosophers people don't read because they're not good writers. They might have brilliant ideas, but their writing is boring. Voltaire goes out of his way to make the writing interesting, and sort of interesting to not just fellow intellectuals and scholars, but to average literate people. So he's basically being complimenting him on being an effective public intellectual by being such a gifted writer, which was certainly true. One of his most famous pieces of writing is his letters regarding the English nation, published in 1733. This is a good example of just the incisive nature of the best Enlightenment analysis. And the conditions under which this book was written are quite interesting. Voltaire got kicked out of France for a time, and so he decided to go across to England and sort of do a study of England. I think he wanted to do the study anyway, but he got kicked out of France for saying something rude to a nobleman. Voltaire wasn't of the nobility, though he came from a fairly well-off family and hobnobbed with the nobility, or at least some of them, as he became a famous writer. Everybody wanted to hang out with Voltaire because he was becoming increasingly famous. But some nobles didn't like the fact that he was sort of hanging around their clubs, and because he had noble friends. And one nobleman that didn't like him said Voltaire, when he was young, becoming famous, changed his name at one point to de Voltaire, which wasn't his real name anyway. I won't give you his real name, it'll just confuse you, but it's a more French-sounding name anyway. But de Voltaire made it sound noble. The DE was generally reserved for nobility. And he wasn't made a noble, he just sort of added that to his name. Maybe trying to sound, sort of like he fit in better with the guys he was hanging around at this point. So the nobleman said in a famous exchange, "Oh, I see, from your name here, that you've moved up in society quite a bit since last time I saw you." Right? Basically, sarcastically saying, "Who do you think you are, putting the DE in front of your name? That's legitimate." And Voltaire, who was extremely quick-witted, shot right back, "Better to take on a new name than to disgrace an old one." Right? Because this guy came from an old noble family, meaning they were nobles for generations, and so he's calling him a disgrace. And the nobleman took great offense, and in fact had Voltaire beat up by a bunch of hoodlums that he sort of employed to do so. And so this is the prices you could pay for not deferring to nobility if you were kind of from the common side of the society. Voltaire wouldn't let it die either. He went on to insult the guy more, and the next thing the guy did was then go to the authorities, and that's what got Voltaire arrested and eventually exiled for a certain amount of time. So it's possible this book wouldn't have got written if that didn't all happen. But Voltaire was proud and quick-witted, which meant he had a smart mouth, and he did pay a price, but it ended up in this book. Sometimes it's called the Philosophical Letters. Sometimes it's called the above title here. But he studied the English, their government, their economic system, their religious beliefs, religious denominations, etc. And He did this somewhat cleverly, although it was pretty obvious what he was doing. Remember, France, unlike England, even in this 18th century, didn't have freedom of the press. So, and the Enlightenment, as we've already noted, was centered in France. So these guys had to be careful what they wrote because of censorship. They get in trouble with the authorities. So the French thinkers, as opposed to their English counterparts, had to be more careful about how they wrote things to avoid, arrest, avoid, making a huge controversy. So there are various ways to do this. One of them was by sarcasm and wit, and just say, "I was just kidding. It was just a joke. I don't agree with that. I'm just sort of poking fun at it because I don't agree with it." Or you could sort of tuck it away in the middle of something else. Hardly anyone will notice. At least the authorities might not notice. This was another way to do it. Again, was clever. He wrote the book about England, and he gave England glowing praise for their political system, for the way they handle religion, and on and on and on. And didn't say anything about France. I mean, he did a little bit, but he basically avoided France. But everybody knew what was going on. By talking about England so much and talking it up, he was actually, without actually having to say it very much, he was criticizing France, basically saying, the English do this right, they do this well, do that well, how come we don't? He didn't have to say that, how come we don't, because he's playing up the strengths of England so much. He talked about Francis Bacon, said that he was so great a man that I've forgotten his vices, which again shows his sense of humor as well. On epistemology, again, how we acquire knowledge, so he was interested in this subject as well. The very essence of things is totally changed. You neither are agreed upon the definition of the soul nor on that of matter. Descartes, as I observed in my last writing, maintains that the soul is the same thing with thought. And Mr. Locke has given a pretty good proof of the contrary. Descartes asserts farther that extension alone constitutes matter, but Sir Isaac Newton, he means, adds solidity to it. How furiously contradictory are these opinions? So I'm not going to work all that out. It's a little bit too incomplete to do so anyway, so you don't have to. The main point there is that Voltaire simply was very much enmeshed in thinking about the writings of other philosophers and 17th century thinkers from the scientific revolution, Descartes, Newton, Locke, and so this guy was extremely familiar with all kinds of subjects, in this case epistemology and the history of writing on epistemology. On taxes, he talks about the British tax system, saying no one is exempted in this country from paying certain taxes just because he's a nobleman or a priest, which of course wasn't true in France. All duties and taxes are settled by the House of Commons, whose power is greater than that of the peers, meaning nobles, though inferior to it in dignity. The spiritual as well as temporal lords have the liberty to reject a money bill brought in by the House of Commons, but they are not allowed to alter it or alter anything in it, and must either pass or throw it out without restriction. When the bill has passed the Lords and is signed by the King, when the whole nation pays, every man in proportion to his revenue or estate, not according to his title, which would be absurd. There is no such thing as an arbitrary subsidy or poll tax, but a real tax on the lands, of all of which an estimate was made in the reign of the famous King William III. He's just laying on the praise, of course, for the British tax system, and it's obvious that he's contrasting it with the French, of which none of these things are true. The nobility didn't pay any taxes at all. So this is a way to skewer his own government and his own leadership without actually having to say it. Although I said moments ago that this was somewhat clever. I say somewhat because most of the political leaders, the smart ones, realized what he was doing, but they couldn't actually pick out words here and say that he was criticizing France. So that's the clever part. He wrote on the London Stock Exchange during his visit, and in this famous book that he published as a result, he says, "Go into the London Stock Exchange, a more respectable place than many a court," meaning like a king's court. and you will see the representatives from all nations gathered together for the utility of men, meaning the usefulness of men. Here, Jew, Mohammedan, and Christian deal with each other as though they were all of the same faith, and only apply the word infidel to people who go bankrupt. Another bit of his sort of humor. Here, the Presbyterian trusts the Anabaptist, and the Anglican accepts a promise from the Quaker. On leaving these peaceful and free assemblies, some go to the synagogue and others for a drink. This one goes to be baptized in a great bath in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. That one has his son's foreskin cut and has some Hebrew words he doesn't understand mumbled over the child. Others go to their church and await the inspiration of God with their hats on, and everybody's happy. So what's he saying? He's saying that unlike France, which is, for a century and a half been ripping itself apart through violent, bloody religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants, in London, in England, there's many different religious groups there, people of, Christian and non-Christian background, as well as different, Christian denominations, and they all get together, at least when they're doing business and trade with each other. So this is part of the reason that the philosophes, Voltaire included, we've seen one other one, we'll see others, were in favor of free market economy, and not just because of the economics. They believed it had a civilizing effect, that it made people more civilized. And we can think of plenty of arguments to say that that's not true today. But nonetheless, I think this is still a decent argument, at least in the 18th century. Compared to what Voltaire experienced in France, he goes into the London Stock Exchange and is sort of shocked. Wow, these are people of multiple different religions that in France people are killing each other over, or have until quite recently, and they're peacefully talking and seem to be smiling and getting along okay, and more than okay, and everything's calm and rational and courteous and kind, considerate. Why don't we do more of that? But he doesn't have to say it. He doesn't mention France in there anywhere. He's just praising England. Voltaire's famous, sharp, sarcastic, witty criticisms, which you've seen a little bit of already, kind of exemplify the importance of language in the Enlightenment. Remember, this guy was considered to be the greatest and best writer of the Enlightenment, and partly his humor and wit show this. There are other features of his writing that do as well, but this especially. This is one of my favorites. You might not find it funny, but I do. He's criticizing the Catholic Church, as he was so known for doing. Voltaire said, not written here, but écrasez la femme, which means sort of abolish the tyranny. And he meant the tyranny of the Catholic Church. Became a famous kind of clarion call for anyone who was opposed to organized religion in general, or the Catholic Church more specifically. Why do we need our bishop's permission to eat eggs, he writes. What bizarre aversion do bishops have for omelets? Can one believe that there have been Catholic tribunals, meaning courts, so imbecile, cowardly, and barbaric that they have condemned to death poor citizens whose only crime was to have eaten horseflesh? Idiotic and cruel priests, to whom do you commend the observations of Lent? The rich, they can observe it all year long. The poor, they have it all year long. The impoverished peasant almost never eats meat and cannot afford to buy fish. Fools, when will you reform your absurd laws? So he goes to great lengths, calling the priests and the church and its officials idiotic, fools, right? Absurd laws, and it starts with kind of a somewhat humorous thing. Why do bishops have this aversion to omelets? Because you can't eat eggs and you can't eat certain things to observe Catholic dogma and tradition. Lent. He's also making a point, a class point, and saying, "What do you mean you can't eat this or that fish?" On Lent, but the poor can't afford fish anyway. What's the point of even telling them that? You don't need to tell them not to eat fish on certain holy days because they can't afford it any day of the week or year. But this is typical of Voltaire. Serious, very sharp criticism, about serious issues, done in a way that's sticking the knife in, but also sort of making light of it at the same time by making some jokes here and there. In a letter to his fellow French philosophe, and sometimes considered the most brilliant thinker of the Enlightenment, and certainly the weirdest of all, as we'll see, he said to Rousseau, "I've read your new book, Against the Human Race, and thank you for it. No one has ever been as witty as you in trying to turn us all into brutes. To read your book makes me want to go on all fours," meaning Rousseau was writing about how civilization had corrupted human beings and people that lived in a kind of a more something like the state of nature, like Native Americans who lived a simpler life, more in touch with nature, and not in these huge urban sprawls. And Rousseau was writing in this book and some of his others that was a superior way of life. And so Voltaire is mocking him, and Rousseau didn't take mocking well at all by anybody. Took much less than that to offend Rousseau, but this letter must have infuriated him because it's so sarcastic. To read your book makes me long to go on all fours. You've got me so interested in communing with nature. I'm going to go outside on all fours and like graze on my lawn. That's what he's basically saying here. So this is a witty but a cutting wit of a response to a book written by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Another famous quote, pretty funny too, giving England a compliment for having, again, religious openness, freedom of religion. He's saying that there's multiple religious groups that are all accepted in England, which wasn't entirely true, but certainly more so than France. So he says England has 42 religions and only 2 sauces. What does that mean? Can you figure that out without me telling you? Right? Even now, especially now, English food has a reputation for being bland and bad and no good. Right? The French are known for their gourmet. Right? Their food is a big part of their culture. The English is too, and I think English food is actually underrated. But nonetheless, it's even famous now to say, yeah, the English food sucks. So he's sort of saying, yeah, their approach to religion is much better than ours, but their food is crappy. So, but he's again saying that there's truth in it to him, but he's saying it tongue in cheek, and try to be funny. And it is pretty funny.